Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
On Christmas Eve, while the snow fell in thick, lazy flakes and the fireplace cracked behind me, my father looked me dead in the eye and said, "You're not welcome here anymore." I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just smiled. Because I knew something he didn't. I spent 17 years living in the house I grew up in, though I wasn't really living, not in the way most people would call it. I was existing, orbiting around the slow collapse of two people I used to call my parents, cleaning up after their spills, tracking medications, arguing with doctors, and catching all the little pieces that fell through the cracks of their increasingly fragile lives. I gave up my career in advertising, sold my little one-bedroom condo in Chicago, and moved back to Greenville, a town where the only exciting thing that ever happened was when the Walmart burned down in '07. I gave up everything because my mom had a stroke, and my dad didn't know how to handle it alone. Back then, I thought it was the right thing. I was 34, single, no kids. Kevin had just gotten married and moved to Miami. "You're just better at this stuff than I am," he said, his voice butter-smooth over the phone, not even offering to fly home. And idiot that I was, nodded like I could see him through the receiver. For 17 Christmases, I set up the tree alone, untangled the lights, replaced dead bulbs, wrapped gifts I bought with my own money, and signed them from Mom and Dad so they wouldn't look bad. I cooked the turkey, mashed the potatoes, even ironed Dad's damn shirts. I kept the bills paid, balanced their checkbooks, handled their Medicare paperwork. When Dad had his mild heart attack in 2017, I sat up 3 nights straight monitoring his oxygen levels because the home nurse was off duty for Thanksgiving. I did that. Me. Not Kevin. Not Pam. Me. So this Christmas, when Kevin and Pam finally decided to grace us with their presence after skipping the last 3 years, it already felt like a disruption. Like a bad storm you see coming on the radar, all red swirls and distant thunder, but you convince yourself it'll just blow over. They showed up on the 23rd, 3 matching suitcases and a smug "hiya" as Pam pushed past me without so much as eye contact. Kevin hugged me like we were cousins who saw each other once every leap year. And Dad, well, Dad lit up like it was the second coming. The first warning sign was the way Dad handed Kevin the keys to the Buick. No words, just a subtle gesture. Kevin hadn't driven that car in 10 years, yet there it was, like some inheritance preview. Then there was the new guest room setup, Mom's old sewing room, the one I'd been using as my private space for writing and breathing, suddenly redecorated with fresh linens and lavender-scented candles. No one told me. I just found my laptop on the floor, my things stuffed into boxes like I was a tenant being evicted from a spare closet. It got weirder. Pam spent a whole morning in the kitchen, reorganizing cabinets she never used, muttering things like, "Once we redo this place, it'll really open up," like they already owned it. Kevin kept whispering with Dad in the garage, and every time I asked what they were doing, it was always, "Oh, nothing, just catching up." My mom, sweet as she once was, sat in her chair watching Hallmark movies with her face blank, her memories slipping in and out like a faulty radio signal. She didn't notice the frost. And then came the phrase. The one that cracked open the whole rotten foundation. I was setting the table for dinner, the same table I had polished the night before, when Kevin leaned over and said, "We've been talking. It might be time for a more professional care situation." I blinked. "Professional?" I said, laughing. "I've been caring for them full-time for 17 years. He smiled like a car salesman. "Exactly. That's not sustainable. You should be living your life." That's when I knew. They wanted me gone. Not because I failed, but because I made them uncomfortable. My presence was proof of their absence. I'd done everything they couldn't, and that made me inconvenient. At dinner, Pam poured wine like it was a victory toast, her fake nails clinking the stem of her glass. Kevin took the seat at the head of the table, Dad's seat, and no one blinked. I brought out the turkey, sat down, and tried to eat around the knot in my stomach. It was during the second round of mashed potatoes that Doug, my father, put his fork down with a loud clink that felt rehearsed. He cleared his throat. "Laura," he said, "we've all had a talk, and, well, you're not welcome here anymore." The room went still. Even Pam stopped chewing. I stared at him for a full 10 seconds. I could hear the radiator ticking behind me and the faint sound of Bing Crosby playing in the background. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I didn't ask why. Instead, I smiled. A slow, knowing smile that made Kevin shift in his seat. Because in that moment, I realized something they'd all forgotten. Something very, very important. I was still the one who paid their mortgage. And I had no intention of doing it ever again. I didn't slam the door when I left, not even a hard click, just a soft pull behind me as I stepped out into the snow, still dressed in the same sweater I wore when my father tossed me out of my own life like a moldy loaf of bread. The air outside was colder than I expected, or maybe it just felt that way because something in me had gone absolutely still, like a lake right before a storm rips it apart. I walked to my car parked 2 houses down, because Kevin had taken my usual spot in the driveway without asking, like everything else he took without asking. I got in, turned the key, and didn't even let the heat kick in before pulling away, because if I sat there for too long, I might have screamed. I didn't scream, though. I didn't cry either. I drove in complete silence, the only sound being the soft, mechanical breath of the defrost blowing against the windshield. I passed old gas stations, the hardware store that shut down last year, and the elementary school where I once cried because a girl named Julie called my mother weird. I remembered how my mom showed up the next day with cupcakes and made all the kids laugh, and how that was the last year she smiled with both corners of her mouth. Back then, I thought the world was mean but fixable. Now I just think some people mistake your love for a service they're entitled to, and they only notice it when the invoice comes due. When I reached my apartment, the 1-bedroom unit I kept downtown above the old bookstore, I climbed the stairs like my legs weighed 100 pounds each. I opened the door, took off my coat, and stood in the middle of the room for a full minute, just listening to nothing. No TV, no dad's cough, no microwave beeping, no arguments. Just silence, and the steady hum of the radiator. Then I walked to the hall closet, reached up onto the top shelf, and pulled down a gray plastic file box labeled with a single strip of masking tape. It read, Plan B. Inside was everything. I'm not exaggerating, everything. Copies of the power of attorney papers Doug signed after his minor heart attack 5 years ago, long before he started calling Pam a good influence and forgot who handled his insulin deliveries. The account numbers. The passwords. The legal advice I paid for out of pocket when I realized being responsible meant more than just running errands. I didn't set out to control their lives, but they were drowning, and I was the only one willing to get wet. Back in 2018, after Dad collapsed in the backyard while raking leaves, the hospital told us he had heart arrhythmia and needed a pacemaker. He spent 3 days in a haze of morphine and regret. On the second day, he grabbed my hand, squeezed it hard, and said, "Make sure your mother doesn't lose the house." I nodded, even though I hadn't lived there in years, even though I knew that place was one bad winter away from collapse. I stayed in that hospital room for hours filling out forms, talking to the financial counselor, faxing documents. By the end of the week, I had power of attorney for health, finances, and estate matters. At the time, it felt like a burden I couldn't refuse. Now it felt like the last sliver of dignity they couldn't take from me. I sat at my small kitchen table, opened my laptop, and logged into the shared family account. The one with all their monthly deposits, pension, Medicare reimbursements, retirement distributions. I knew the numbers by heart. I had managed their expenses down to the penny. In fact, over the last 5 years, I saved them nearly $50,000 a year. That's nearly $300,000 total. I organized everything, automated their utilities, negotiated with the insurance company over and over until I knew their hold music by memory. And not once, not even once, Did I ask them for a paycheck? I scrolled through the recent activity and saw Kevin had already added his name to one of the secondary credit cards. Cute. Probably planned to use it for some house improvements Pam would talk about on Facebook while sipping wine and filming the wallpaper for her followers. They really believed they could shove me aside and pretend none of this ever happened. As if I'd been the help all along, waiting to be dismissed when my usefulness expired. Well, I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. I opened a blank document, typed out a new sequence of actions, and titled it simply, Freeze Protocol. It wasn't elaborate, just clean, efficient steps to begin limiting their access to the accounts until I could speak to my lawyer. I wasn't about to do anything illegal. I didn't need to. I had the legal authority, and more importantly, I had the paper trail. If they wanted to cut me out of the family, they were going to have to live like I never existed, which meant no more organized bills, no more hidden overdraft protections, no more quiet corrections to their careless mistakes. I saved the file, leaned back in my chair, and stared at the ceiling while the radiator hissed behind me. I had never felt so tired, but also never so alive. It was strange, like I'd just come back from the dead, and the air tasted different. I was done being the cushion they fell on. From now on, they'd hit the floor. As I shut my laptop and pushed the file box back under the table, I whispered to no one in particular, "Let's see how Pam handles this." The snow outside thickened, falling like the ash before a fire, not loud, not fast, but steady. And I sat there, waiting for the match to drop. The morning after being told I wasn't welcome anymore, I woke up to the soft hiss of the radiator in my apartment, a dull gray light spilling through the window, and the hollow quiet that follows a decision you know you'll never walk back. I sat up slowly, not groggy, not confused, just clear. Cold, clean clarity that had settled into me like ice in still water. My fingers moved before I even consciously formed the thought. I reached for my laptop on the nightstand, opened the lid, and watched the glow light up my face as if the screen were some sort of altar. And in a way, I guess it was. I glanced at the clock in the bottom right corner. 7:56. For minutes until the whole damn house, Kevin, Pam, Doug, and what was left of my mom, got a crash course in what happens when you cut off the one person keeping the entire operation afloat. They thought I was a maid with a martyr complex. They thought I'd just melt into the wallpaper, take my scolding, and slink off like a whipped dog. But I wasn't crying. I wasn't second-guessing. I wasn't grieving. Not anymore. I took a sip of stale water from a glass I hadn't moved in 2 days, then opened the banking app. The family trust account, the one I'd managed down to the cent for 5 years, sat quietly with its usual balance, enough to cover their property taxes, food, prescriptions, and the overpriced birdhouse subscription Pam insisted on gifting Marlene every damn year. I clicked Freeze Account. A confirmation window popped up, asking, "Are you sure?" I didn't blink. I clicked Yes. Next, the Utilities Buffer Account, a small reserve I created when Doug kept forgetting to pay the electric bill on time back in 2019. Same process. Freeze. Confirm. Done. Finally, the household expense card, the one I used to track groceries, prescriptions, and that bizarre veterinary bill when Doug decided to feed a raccoon for a month and then got bit. That account had been converted to a joint card just 2 weeks ago, and Kevin had already made 3 charges at a wine shop, a designer clothing outlet, and one suspiciously vague Pam's wellness spa. I froze it, stared at the access suspended message, and felt nothing but the warm rush of long-delayed satisfaction. The clock struck 8. Meanwhile, back at the house, I imagined Kevin rolling out of bed in his hideous candy cane pajamas, already bragging about how good he is with money now that the system's finally being modernized. Pam would be fluffing her hair in the hallway mirror, talking about how she'd always known Laura was unstable. And Doug? He'd probably be sitting silently in his recliner, coffee in one hand, remote in the other, wondering if what he did had been too harsh, but too damn proud to say it. I pictured Kevin whipping out the credit card to order brunch, Maybe something overpriced and ridiculous, like custom croissants and organic turkey bacon. He probably had it all queued up on his phone, smiling that smug, soft smile he always had when he thought he was being clever. But when he hit submit payment, he'd see it, the ugly little pop-up no one ever wants. Transaction declined. Please contact your financial institution. Pam would panic first. That woman was all surface, all appearances, and nothing made her spiral faster than public embarrassment or the idea of being denied something she felt entitled to. She'd try another card, maybe even call the bank herself, all while acting like this was some glitch, some technical fluke, never suspecting that someone had planned this with military precision. Doug would check his phone next, frowning at the push notification that read, "Access restricted. Please contact your legal representative." And he'd know. Maybe not everything, but enough. He'd know that I hadn't taken my exile lying down. He'd know that I had the power because he was the one who gave it to me 5 years ago in a hospital room when he thought he was dying and didn't trust Kevin with so much as a houseplant. The power of attorney wasn't just symbolic. It was real. As long as he was alive and I was the designated guardian, I had every legal right to manage, move, freeze, or even close those accounts. The bank didn't ask questions because the paperwork was solid. The notary's stamp was still crisp on every page. And no, Kevin couldn't override it. Not without a lawyer and a damn good reason, and my sister's mien didn't exactly hold up in probate court. But as I sat there, staring at the snow dusting the windowsill and listening to the muffled hum of the street outside, something odd crept in through the cracks. It wasn't guilt exactly, more like a whisper of grief for the version of myself that had bent over backwards for these people. The daughter who made spreadsheets, who argued with insurance reps, who stayed up late holding mom's hand through another confused episode, who watched her youth slip by in that drafty old house with its leaky roof and fading wallpaper. I didn't regret freezing the accounts. I didn't even feel bad for the panic that was no doubt unfolding in my absence. But a small part of me, a buried part, wondered if I had done this because I wanted to teach them a lesson, or if I had done it because I was finally, truly, done with all of them. The question hung in the air like the last note of a song you didn't know was ending. My phone lit up on the table. Dad flashed across the screen. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times. Then I picked up and put it on speaker. "Laura," he said, his voice low, maybe tired, maybe angry, I couldn't tell. I didn't wait. I just leaned back, smiled like the snow couldn't touch me anymore, and said, "Happy holidays, Dad. How's that new financial advisor working out?" Then I hung up. Just like that. No screaming. No closure. Just a clean, cold end. 3 days passed after the Christmas morning shutdown, and not a single apology arrived, not a text, not a knock, not even one of those half-hearted, condescending voicemails that start with, "Let's just be reasonable." What I got instead was a curt email from Kevin with the subject line, "Family meeting, urgent," and the body of the message was a single sentence, "We need to talk. Everyone will be there. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The arrogance of it nearly made me laugh, the way he assumed he could summon me like I was still on call, like I was a damn maid with a clipboard and no spine. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't have anything to say, but because silence was the only language they seemed to respect now. The next afternoon, there was a knock at my apartment door. I didn't even have to look through the peephole. I could smell the cologne, that overly sharp scent Doug used to drown himself in before Sunday church and VA meetings. I opened the door slowly, calmly, and there he stood, not red-faced, not ashamed, not angry even. Just serious, lips pressed into a line like he was about to lay down the rules of a contract negotiation, not talk to the daughter he'd kicked out on Christmas Eve. "I came to make this right," he said, but it didn't sound like a peace offering. It sounded like a man who thought he was being very generous for not yelling. I leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed, and said nothing. He took that as permission to keep going. "Kevin says we need to move forward, all of us," he continued, not meeting my eyes. He's been looking into refinancing options. Things need to be stable, especially with your mother's condition. Stable, I repeated, trying not to laugh in his face. Doug, you froze me out of my own life 3 days ago, and now you're here talking about stability? He shifted, uncomfortable but clearly determined. Look, it was never supposed to come to this. Pam she said you'd been acting erratic. Controlling. I didn't know what to believe. That's when I stepped aside and let him in, not because I forgave him, but because I wanted him to see the paperwork. I walked to my kitchen table and pulled out the binder. I had kept everything, every receipt, every email, every bank statement, categorized and color-coded like a well-run business. Because that's what I had been running, the business of 2 people's lives. I dropped it on the table with a heavy thud and opened to the first tab. Let me show you something, I said, flipping to the spreadsheets that detailed every grocery bill, medication copay, heating bill, car maintenance cost, and house repair from the last 15 years. You see that number? I pointed to the bottom line of the annual total. That's what I paid out of my own pocket in 2019. And that? I flipped another page. That's what I covered when your insurance lapsed in 2020. And here, another flip. That's the $1,874 I spent fixing the roof last spring because Kevin said we should wait and see how bad it gets. Doug stood there silently, eyes scanning numbers he probably didn't understand, shoulders stiff. Not once, I said, my voice low but sharp enough to cut glass, not once did I take a single dollar for myself. I never charged rent. I never took reimbursement. I never even asked for gas money when I drove Mom to her appointments. You know why? He didn't answer. Because I was raised to believe that family means something. That we take care of each other. That love is supposed to be shown through actions, not just the occasional Hallmark card or Facebook post. He opened his mouth, probably to say something about how it wasn't about the money, but I raised my hand and kept going. And now you're here to negotiate? To strike some kind of deal because your precious golden son can't keep the lights on without me holding the extension cord. That's when the door opened behind him and Pam walked in without knocking, bold as brass, hair perfectly done, jacket slung over one arm like she lived there. We need to talk about the house, she said, skipping right past any attempt at pleasantries. Kevin and I think it's time it was transferred to our name. We're going to need equity if we're going to keep taking care of your parents. I blinked, stunned not by the audacity, but by the sheer shamelessness of it. You want me to sign over the house, I said slowly, as if repeating it would make it sound less insane. She smiled, that sugar-coated passive-aggressive smile she'd perfected over the years. It just makes sense. You're not involved anymore. Kevin's stepping up. Stepping up. I turned to Doug. Is that what she told you? That Kevin's stepping up while I'm out here being unstable? Doug looked away, guilt flickering on his face like a faulty bulb, but still not enough to spark a damn thing resembling remorse. And that's when it clicked. This wasn't about family. It was never about love or gratitude or concern. It was about power, about control, about how easily someone like Pam could slither into the cracks of our family and convince the weakest link to cut loose the one person who actually gave a damn. She said I was dangerous? I asked, voice quiet now, but shaking. She told you I was unstable? She said you were making financial decisions without oversight, Doug mumbled, suddenly finding the floor very interesting. I laughed then, sharp and humorless. I was the oversight, Doug. That was the whole damn point. Pam started to say something else, some ridiculous speech about boundaries and healing and moving forward together, but I was done. I walked over to the door, opened it wide, and said, You wanted me gone? I'm gone. And now so is your savings. Then I slammed it shut behind them. They knocked once more. I didn't answer. They stood out there in the hallway for another minute, maybe waiting for me to change my mind. But that family meeting they wanted so badly? It never happened. And it never will. I didn't leave town with a bang or a speech or some theatrical final confrontation that wrapped everything in a neat little bow, because life isn't a movie and the people who hurt you the deepest never stick around for the credits. I packed my things in quiet pieces, one box at a time, over 3 late nights with no music, no phone calls, no announcements. I didn't even tell my landlord I was leaving until the morning of the move, just handed him the keys, thanked him for not raising the rent last year, and walked away without looking back at the door I'd opened and closed more times than I could count. The place I found was 4 states away, tucked into the edge of a sleepy town where no one knew my name or my history or the way I used to walk around carrying other people's burdens like unpaid debts. I rented a small duplex with a cracked walkway and an old oak tree out front that dropped leaves the size of dinner plates. It wasn't fancy, but it was mine, and for the first time in almost 2 decades, I slept without the sound of someone else's needs banging around inside my head. The first few weeks passed like fog, thick and heavy but not unwelcome. I spent my mornings walking aimlessly, just breathing in air that wasn't soaked in old resentments and stale arguments. I got a part-time job at the library downtown, shelving books and helping retirees reset their passwords on donated laptops. No one asked about my past. No one cared about who I used to be. And for the first time, that felt like a blessing rather than a punishment. But healing doesn't happen on a schedule, and peace doesn't mean the memories stop. They come in waves, unexpected, uneven, and inconvenient. Sometimes it's a smell, like burnt toast or old spice, or a sound, like the creak of floorboards, that brings everything rushing back. And in those moments, I don't miss them, not really, but I do mourn the time I lost trying to prove I was worthy of love that was always conditional. Then, 3 months after I'd left, I got the call. It came from Mrs. Holloway, the neighbor 2 houses down from my parents, the one who used to bake banana bread every Saturday and who always left her porch light on during storms, just in case. Her voice was tight and hesitant. "Laura, I'm sorry to bother you, but I thought you should know. Your folks, well, things don't look too good over there." I sat on the edge of my bed, hand clenched around the phone, barely breathing. "They've been missing appointments, and Kevin's not around as much as he said he would be," she continued. "I saw Marlene walking outside in just a bathrobe last week. It was 32 degrees. I thanked her, told her I'd take care of it, and hung up without promising a damn thing. I didn't rush to fix anything. I didn't pack a bag or book a ticket. I just sat there staring at my laptop, the cursor blinking like it had a heartbeat of its own, and I opened the banking portal I hadn't touched since the day I shut it all down. The accounts were still frozen. No one had undone what I'd done. They probably didn't know how. Or maybe they thought I'd come back and clean up the mess eventually, like I always had. But I didn't reactivate them. Not the main one, not the utilities reserve, not the emergency medical fund I'd painstakingly built from leftover reimbursements and scrimped grocery savings. I only reactivated one small, separate account, an old side fund Dad had once insisted we create for incidentals, though he never defined what that actually meant. I left exactly $1 in it. Then I mailed them a card. No return address. No signature. Just a plain white envelope with Doug's name on it, and inside, a note written in my careful, even handwriting. "You always said I'd amount to nothing. You were wrong. I amounted to the only person who ever gave a damn." There was no demand, no threat, no explanation. Just that sentence and the truth that had sat coiled in my chest like a loaded spring for the better part of my adult life. I don't know if he read it. I don't know if he understood it. I don't know if he called Kevin and yelled, or if he just sat there, holding the card like a burning coal that wouldn't cool down. And the truth is, I don't need to know. Forgiveness is a tricky thing. Some people wear it like a badge of honor, parade it around like proof of their nobility, like letting go means they've grown or healed or evolved. But I've come to believe forgiveness isn't always deserved, and more importantly, it isn't always necessary. Sometimes, walking away is the loudest thing you can do. Sometimes, leaving someone with the consequences of their own actions is the most honest kind of love there is. Because love isn't unconditional, not the real kind. Real love has terms and boundaries and expectations. And when it's one-sided for long enough, it stops being love and starts being survival dressed up in guilt. I don't know if Doug regrets what he did. I don't know if Pam still tells herself she did the right thing, or if Kevin ever wakes up in the middle of the night realizing he isn't half the man he pretended to be. I don't know if Mom even remembers I'm gone. All I know is I'm not going back. I used to think love meant sacrifice. But sometimes love means knowing when to stop bleeding for people who keep stabbing you. Merry Christmas, Dad.